set. Jerry's there. Hi, Joan. I heard. I'm very excited.
Shabbos. Shabbos now.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah, I know the others are more concert, yeah. So usually I take that here, but.
Shabbos, Steve.
Shabbat shalom. Good morning.
Shalom. Robert. How's mother? Okay.
Yeah, so I'm happy to do it when I come.
Sue.
So I'm gonna walk you through what I do. Alex, look up everything with the computer. This stuff stays on.
Is Sue with Bob or Sue with Dan?
Speakers in this room, and that's on here. So if we go to page, the second page, oh wow. This is the Lima light, and that's the one we use. That's the first one talking about, the Lima microphone.
Yes. What'd you say? No. Although, just so you know, that's the shul library's copy. I assume that someone gave it to us, or I'm not entirely sure. But I have been in touch with the publisher, and he is going to send us a box of 25 loaners to try out for as long as we want. So you're welcome to use it this morning, but you should also know that my plan is he said we can hold on to them for essentially a month or two, or until he needs them back, because he's got a loaner. I mean, it makes sense, right? He's got a loaner set that he can send out to people. So you're welcome to use it this morning. You also can just wait if you want till we all try it together. The one thing that I know is weird about that Siddur that I would warn you if you're going to use it. Man, so many people. It's okay. Let's start in a minute. Good morning, everyone. Shabbat shalom. We'll get started in just a couple minutes.
This does not affect anybody else's sound. So.
You know, there's an echo. I don't do that well. How old are you, okay?
Yes. I mean, I think it's made for Abu Dhabi, essentially, right? Like people who don't belong to the denomination.
Look like Leah.
I cannot see people on this.
Yeah.
Right. So listen through these things to hear what they're
Yeah.
doing.
So-
You can't hear.
You're welcome to this morning for the ones that is not going to be
The
here.
other thing is there are speakers on here.
Talk about how we want to roll them out the drive.
Oh, 1, 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Two things going on.
It is Bonnie.
Zoom.
You should
And
know.
the speakers in the room are controlled
You're right.
left. That's the one thing that choose, right in the middle of the tower. That is, I can include that. If you want to try to do that. Turn them down.
Yeah. I'll let you know, I'm pretty sure, and pretty straightforward. I mean, the only thing that I think that I would do is like, really different is the healing service, but otherwise, there's
So you just need to know where
yeah, and I'll have
Parsha.
Started on the first day, Professor has the work site, and said it was nice. And that's when we follow up
So how do you get there? So now I'm but if I want to close in on just the emails, so one. There's a number and then button shot. There's one. There's two.
Lower until they actually go on.
That's a usual one. Keep that for the three, close up at the right angle. I like that too. Four is even closer than one. That's right in the space. Four and one, three. You can choose either one. And then, I love doing that one. Taking the Torah out and start what about when people unmute? No.
Okay, and we say what it is, or either, okay, we can say that.
He has access to this.
Yeah.
So when he says you want to put it in for
Yeah.
healing service. Everything was. And I try to have it here. Do a voice check.
Sure. Shabbat Shalom, folks on Zoom. We will get started in just 1 or 2 minutes more. Just getting settled here in the sanctuary. We'll get started in just a little bit. It's good to see you all. And thank you all for being on time.
And then
All right, I know our crowd is a little bit thin in the room, but I do think more people will be coming, and I do want to respect the time of those who are here on time. And if we're going to start early, we may as well keep ourselves on track to end at a reasonable hour too. So I think we're going to get going this morning. Actually, we'll get going in 1 sec. I just have to make one more adjustment. Yes.
I can mute him, right?
Yes. Great. Now we're really ready to get started. Sorry about that. This morning we will be reading Parshat Vayeitze and really delving into the story of Jacob and his in-laws and his wives and his children and all of the intrigue that entails, and especially in the section that we read as the third part of the triennial. There's a really strong theme and undercurrent, not even an undercurrent, there's a really strong current throughout the text of theft, which is something that I'll be talking a little bit more about, and I'm sure we'll talk about as we're reading through the text and discussing together. So I wanted to start with a poem about theft. And this is called The Theft. It's by a poet named Gregory Janikian. I don't know exactly how to pronounce that, but I can spell it for you if you want to see after services. And the poem starts with a quote, and then it goes in to the actual poetry. So this is called The Theft. Someone broke into his home and carefully removed all of the buttons from his 40 sport coats and vests from a news story, and touched nothing else, not the ingots in the hollow newel, or the diamond in the ice cube, the chalice in a pot of zinnias. He retrieved the gold brooch from a boot, the treasury bonds from a hamper, checked his mailbox for a likely note. Had he found what he was looking for, a broken vase, the silverware strewn like spare change on the floor, and things whose worth had flared irrevocably, from their very centers, gone, he would have nodded yes, breathed easier, resigned to having proven to himself the scrutable nature of our deepest wants. But he could make of the crime no more than what it was, a theft of buttons, and what agreements he had privately struck with the world, and its curious ways were off like his buttons. Time looped him, once, twice, then veered into the steep acclivity that is the future. If he dreamt, breathless at night, On his bed, it was always of buttons. Gold, blue, brown ones, tumbling upward into the rarefied air of the unloosened. If he spoke, it was to himself, save for what he could disclose. How he had stood one day at his closet, stupefied, leaden-legged, prepared for every eventuality but one. And if he wished anything, it was to be a thief, running wild and blessed into the streets of the city, 100 buttons tucked and shining, like coins in the folds of his clothes, to whom nothing was sacred, or else everything was. And I hope you'll be able to kind of hold on to those words and images and thoughts throughout services this morning, and certainly by the time we get to the Torah reading in a little bit. And for now, we'll turn to page 61 and begin together with Matovu. Matovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. Matovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. And we will turn to the top of page 65 and rise for Berchot HaShachar. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natal saviv ina levchim ben yom uven laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani b'tzalmo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasani ben chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam pokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam malbish arumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zokef kefufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam rokah haaretz al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shasali kol tzorki. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamechin mitzadei gaver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam ozer Yisrael bigvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oter Yisrael b'tifara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hanoten le'ayif koach. Praised are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, removing sleep from my eyes and slumber from my eyelids. You may be seated, at least for a minute, as we continue on the bottom of page 72 with Tzadik Tamar, the concluding paragraph of the Psalm for Shabbat. Tzadik Tamar yifrach ke'erez balvanon yizkeh shetulim beveit Adonai v'chatzrot Eloheinu yafrichu od yenuvun b'seva t'shenim v'rananim yiyu lehagid ki ashar Adonai tzuri velo avlatabo. And we will turn together to page 83 and rise for Baruch She'amar. Baruch She'amar v'haya ha'olam baruch hu. Baruch oseh v'reshit. Baruch omer ve'oseh. Baruch Zeru Mekayim Baruch Merachem Al Haaretz Baruch Merachem Al Habriot Baruch Meshalem Sachar Tov Lireyav Baruch Chailad V'Kayam Lanetzach Baruch Podeh Umatzil Baruch Shemo Baruch Shemo. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, compassionate creator, extolled by your people, glorified by your faithful servants. We laud you with the psalms of your servant David. We extol you in song. We celebrate your fame and melody. We proclaim you sovereign, singular, eternal God. Praised are you, Adonai, sovereign, magnified with songs of praise. You may be seated. We'll turn together to page 96 and continue with the Ashrei. Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha Od Halucha Selah Ashreiham Shekachalo Ashreiham Shadonai Elohav Tehillah LeDavid Aromimcha Elohai HaMelech Vavarcha Shimcha Leolam Vaed Bechol Yom Avarcheka Ba'ala Shimcha Leolam Vaed Gadol Adonai Mulah Meod Ve'ligdulato ein cheker Dor l'dor shabach masecha Ugvurotecha yagidu Hadar kevod hodecha B'divrei niflotecha asicha Ve'zuz nerotecha yomeru Ugdulatcha asaprena Zecher avtucha yabiu Ve'tzitkatcha yiranenu Anun rachum Adonai, erech apayim ugdal chased, tov Adonai lakol, verachamav al kol ma'asav, yoduch Adonai kibtzecha, vechasidecha yevarchucha, kevod malchutcha yomeru, ugvuratcha yedaberu, lehodia livnei adam grotav, Ukvod hadar malchuto, malchutcha malchut kol amim, umemshaltecha bechol dor vador. Somech Adonai lechol hanoflim, vezokef lechol hakfufim. Einei kol eches aberu, vatanoten lahem et ochlam beito. Poteach et yadecha, umatzbiya lechol chai ratzon. Tzadik Adonai bechol drachav, v'chasid bechol ma'asav. Karov Adonai lechol korav, lechol asher yikrauhu be'emet. Retzon rav yaseh, et shavatam yishma v'yoshiyim. Shomer Adonai kol avav, ve'kol ershaim yashmid. Tehillat Adonai lebe'er pi, v'varech kol bashar shkodsho le'olam va'ed. V'anachnu nevarech ya, me'ata v'yad olam, hallelujah. And in just a moment, we'll turn to page 100 and continue with Psalm 150. Psalm 150, of course, is, the kind of all the different ways of praising God and celebrating God through music. And there is an interesting little tie-in to our reading this morning, as we'll read later, when Yaakov and his father-in-law Lavan are going back and forth about kind of their anger of Jacob sneaking off in the middle of the night. His father-in-law Lavan says to him, this is chapter 30, verse 26, 27, and 28. What did you mean by keeping me in the dark and carrying off my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee in secrecy and mislead me and not tell me? I would have sent you off with festive music, with timbrel and lyre. And so we get this idea of kind of what it might have meant in antiquity to be celebrating with music, right? And the ways in which people would have honored other people, and the ways in which kind of playing music really creates this festive atmosphere, which is what I think we're trying to channel in Psalm 150. Hallelujah, 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 El bekodsho. Hallelujah, hallelujah, birki auzo. Hallelujah, 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 bigvurotav. Hallelujah, hallelujah, kerov kulo. Hallelujah, 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 beteka shofar. Hallelujah, hallelujah, benevel vechinor. Hallelujah, 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 betov umachol. Hallelujah, hallelujah, beminim ve'ugav. Hallelujah, 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 betil tele shama. Hallelujah, hallelujah, betil tele trua. Kol hanshama tehallel hallelujah. Kol hanshama tehallel hallelujah. Kol hanshama tehallel hallelujah. And we'll continue on the second paragraph of page 102 as we rise for the opening of Az Yashir together. Az Yashir Moshe uvenei Yisrael et hashira hazod ladonai vayomru le'emor ashira ladonai ki goga sus verachvo rama v'hayam ozi vezimratya vayihi li lishua ze'eli ve'anvehu Elohei aviv aromemenhu. And in the middle of page 103, Adonai imloch leolam va'ed. Adonai imloch leolam va'ed. Ki l'Adonai hamucha Moshe Boim, alu Moshim v'artzon l'shpotet harei sab. V'aytal Adonai hamelucha, v'hay Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz. Vayomo Adonai echad, u'shemo echad. You may be seated. We'll continue in the middle of page 105. Ha'el betatzumo tuzecha, hagadol bichvod shemecha, hagibor lanatzach, fano rabbi noratecha, hamelech hayoshev, al kisei ram v'nisa, shochen ad marom v'kadosh shemaho. V'chatuv ranu tzadikim b'Adonai l'shirim navatila befi sharim titalal v'divrei tzadikim titbarach uvilshon chastim titromam uvekerev kedoshim titkadash uv'makalot rivvot amcha beit Yisrael b'rinat b'ashim chamakin b'chol dor v'dor. Sheken chovat korchim lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'le'avotenu v'imotenu lehodot la'alel shabech l'faer l'romem l'hader l'varech la'alel kales al kol dirishiro v'tishbachot David ben Yishai avdecha meshichecha. And on the top of 106 we rise. Yishtabach shimcha la'ad malkeinu. Melech HaGadol VaKadosh B'Shamayim V'Aretz. Ki L'chanei Adonai Eloheinu v'Le'avotenu v'Imotenu Shir U'Shvacha Halal V'Zimra Oz Memshla Netzach L'Gvura Tila V'Tiferet Kedusha U'Malchut Brachot Ve'odot Me'ata V'Ad Olam Baruch Atah Adonai El Melech Gadol Batishbachot El Ha'odot Adon HaNiflaot Habucher B'Shirei Zimra Melech Elchei Ha'olamim. And we are not there yet in terms of having 10 people in this room, so we're going to keep our fingers crossed, but we'll also be seated and continue on the top of page 107. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, yotzer or uvorei choshech, oseh shalom, uvorei et hakol. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, creating light and fashioning darkness, ordaining the order of all creation. And we'll pick up at the bottom of page 107, 3 lines from the bottom with Ein Kirkecha, which will lead us into El Adon on page 108. Ein Kirkecha Adonai Eloheinu b'olam hazeh, v'yenzladecha malkeinu l'chayei ha'olam haba. Efes biltecha golenu mot HaMashiach, V'endo melech HaMoshienu l'tchiat hametim. El Adon al kol hamasim baruch umvorach befi kol neshama gadlo v'tuvo malei olam da'at u'tfuna sovevimoto. Hamid Gael Chayot HaKodesh V'nehedar B'chavod HaMerkava Zechut U'mishor Lifnei Chiso Chesed V'rachamim Lifnei Kevodo Tovim Meorot Shebara Eloheinu Yitzaram B'da'at B'vina U'faskel Koach U'gvura Natan bahem liot moshlim bekerev tevel meleim ziv umfikim nogana ezivam bechol haolam semechim betzeitam vesasim bevoam osim b'eim ha'retzon konam Pe'er v'chavod notnim lishmot alav verina lezecher malchuto kara l'shemesh v'yizrach ora'a v'hitkin surat halvana shevach notnim lo kol tzeva marom Tiferet u'gedula shrafim v'ofanim v'chayot hakodesh. Nai 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 And we will pick back up 3 lines from the bottom of page 110 with Or Chadash. Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir. V'nizke kulanu meheira leoro. V'nizke kulanu meheira leoro. Baruch atah Adonai yotzer hameorot. And on the top of page 111, please read with me together in the English. Deep is your love for us, Adonai, our God, boundless your tender compassion. Avinu Malkeinu, you taught our ancestors life-giving laws. They trusted in you. For their sake, graciously teach us. Our Maker, merciful Provider, show us mercy, grant us discernment and understanding. Then will we study your Torah, heed its words, teach its precepts, and follow its instruction, lovingly fulfilling all its teachings. Open our eyes to your Torah, help our hearts to cleave to your mitzvot, unite all our thoughts to love and revere you. Then we will never be brought to shame, for we trust in your awesome holiness and will delight in your deliverance. Bring us safely from the four corners of the earth and lead us in dignity to our holy land, for you are the source of deliverance. You have called us from all peoples and tongues, constantly drawing us nearer to you, that we may lovingly offer you praise, proclaiming your oneness. Praised are you, Adonai, who loves the people Israel. Baruch ata Adonai, habocher b'amo Yisrael, b'yahava. Page 112, the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol meodecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi metzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam B'shivtecha b'veitecha u'v'lechtecha v'aderech u'v'shochbecha u'v'kumecha u'kshartam leot al yadecha v'hayu totafot b'neinecha u'chtavtam al mezuzot beitecha u'v'isharecha. And we'll continue silently on page 112 and pick back up at the top of 113. Top of 113. Vayomer Adonai Moshe Lemor daber el bnei Yisrael ve'amarta alehem v'asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei vigdehem l'dorotam v'natnu al tzitzit hakanaf petil techelet vayalachem l'tzitzit Uritem oto, schartem et kol mitzvot Adonai vasitem otam, velo taturu acharei levavchem acharei einechem, asher atem zonim achreihem, leman tizkeru vasitem et kol mitzvotai, vitem kedoshim lelohechem, ani Adonai Elohechem. Asher hotiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem le'Elohim ani Adonai Elohechem emet Adonai Elohechem emet. And in just a moment, we'll continue in the middle of page 114 with Mi Chamocha. We're still waiting for a couple more friends to come in through the front door, so after Mi Chamocha, we'll continue straight away with a couple minutes for silent prayer, reflection, and meditation, and come back together with Oseh Shalom. But first, middle of page 114. Tehilot le'elyon baruch u'mborach Moshe Miriam u'bnei Yisrael lechanu shira b'simcha rabah ve'amru chulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh Nora tehilot osef ele Shira chadasha shibchu gulim l'shimcha svat hayam Yachad kulam hoduvim lichu ve'amaru Adonai imloch leolam va'ed Tzur Yisrael kuma be'ezrat Yisrael Ufdechinu mecha Yehuda ve'Yisrael Go aleinu Adonai tzvot shemo Kedosh Yisrael Baruch Ata Adonai Gal Yisrael. The silent Amidah begins on page 115b. Ose shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru, imru, amen. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, v'meru, amen. So, we're going to pause here for a second. We only have 8 people in the building, which is a little bit frustrating. I'm not frustrated with any of you who are either in the building or, at home over Zoom listening to this. It's just, something that I think, it's a pattern we've been dealing with really since the holidays ended, and haven't quite been able to put our finger on as to exactly why, although there's plenty of theories. Something we're going to need to continue to figure out. And I find myself, this morning constantly looking at the page we're on and looking at the time on my watch and just hoping that I'll hear the sound of the door opening. But I have not heard that sound as often as I would like. And I'm not giving up hope because I also know, we still haven't figured out exactly how to connect the people in the room and the people over Zoom in a way that feels meaningfully enough to truly make it a hybrid minyan. But there are people who are counting on us having a minyan, both to be able to say Kaddish, to be able to say El Maleh. And so I'm not going to give up hope. At 8, I'm not going to give up hope that we're still, that we can get to 10. But what I think we'll do in order to both kind of stall a little bit, but also to make that time meaningful, at least for a couple minutes, is I think we will turn to our Chumashim and do a little bit of Parsha and Torah discussion, because it's a really interesting part of the Torah, and why not? So I'll give everyone a minute to open up their Chumash if they're in the room. I also, for the sake of Zoom, what I think we'll do is, since I do have my computer up here, I'll share the screen with the portion that we're reading, and we'll basically, we'll read a little bit in English and reflect and discuss. And we're actually, one of the advantages of doing this is I feel, when we do stick strictly to the triennial cycle, we're often kind of dropped into the middle of narratives and storylines, and having a little bit more flexibility will actually kind of really enable us to get a more full picture of what's going on in this morning's portion. So as I said earlier, this morning we're going to read Parshat Vayeitze, and where we would pick up in the triennial cycle is in the middle of chapter 31, which is chapter 31, verse 17, which begins on 181. And it should not be a great surprise that if we're picking up right in the middle of a chapter, we're also going to be picking up right in the middle of a storyline. And so this morning, so I'll give kind of the full intro to the Parsha, and then the parts that we're still not going to read. I want us to start at the beginning of chapter 31 on page 180, and then we will actually look at the text a little bit. So chapter 30, Parshat Vayeitze, is the story of Jacob. Isaac and Rebekah and even Esau are very firmly out of the picture. We pick up as Jacob is kind of running away from his angry brother after stealing his birthright and his blessing. And he's going off to his uncle's house in Haran, his uncle Lavan. On the way there, he falls asleep on his journeys and using a rock as a pillow. He has a dream of the famous dream of Jacob's ladder, the angels going up and down. It's notable that he's using a rock as a pillow because we kind of see through that just how alone and kind of poverty-stricken Jacob is at this moment, as opposed to when Abraham sent his servant off to find Isaac a wife, he was laden with a camel train and all kinds of riches and servants and gold and silver and jewels. Jacob pretty much leaves with the clothes on his back. He doesn't even have a pillow or a bedroll. He's sleeping on the ground with a rock. And this is really Jacob's first direct encounter with God in this dream with the angels. And we'll see throughout this portion and really in the portions to come, kind of how close Jacob's relationship is with God. They tend to talk to each other quite a bit. So when Jacob gets to Haran, to the area where his uncle lives, he gets to a well and he finds a woman who just happens to be his cousin out with her father's flock. That is Rachel. They introduce themselves. Jacob is instantly smitten, and he goes back and tells his uncle that he would like to marry Rachel. He initially is told that he will work for 7 years and he will be given Rachel's hand. Of course, we all know how this story ends. He works for the 7 years. They are to be married, and Jacob gets married to, as far as the text is concerned, the woman that he thinks is Rachel, and wakes up the next morning and it's her older sister, Leah. And that is really, this is portrayed as an act of trickery. I think the theme that runs most consistently through this portion is, trickery back and forth, especially between Jacob and his father-in-law Lavan. And so Jacob goes to Lavan. He says, "What the heck did you do?" And Lavan says, "Well, it's our custom that the oldest daughter gets married first, and so I enacted that custom without telling you. But don't worry, you can work another 7 years, and I'll give you Rachel also." And Jacob kind of is such a love-struck fool that he doesn't even think twice about that. And there is a really beautiful verse about that. Since we're going through the whole Parsha, it's worth reading. So Jacob, it's verse 29, chapter 29, verse 20. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. Which is a nice kind of poetic, just a really beautiful kind of poetic thought. It also does bring up some of the tension and discomfort around, that's how much he loves Rachel, but how kind of little does he love Leah. And that is kind of the driver of the second part of the portion, which is Rachel is barren and Leah is incredibly fertile. And so, Leah is declared as the less loved wife, but she is the one who is able to have lots of kids, and specifically lots of boy children. And here we see the tension between these two sisters playing out in kind of their desire to win the affection their husband through having through having children. And Leah initially gives birth to 4 sons. Rachel gets sad and jealous, and so her initial plan is to give her handmaiden to Jacob as a wife to have sons on her behalf. And she has 2 sons, and then Leah gets jealous of that, and so she gives her handmaiden to Jacob as another wife, and then she has 2 sons, and then Leah has 1 more son, so the count right now is, I believe, is 10, and then Rachel finally has a son who is Joseph, and that's number 11, and that's the lineage that we get in this portion. And then at the end of kind of this time period, and this is where we move into chapter 30 and chapter 31, Jacob basically realizes that he's been working for a long time, 20 years in total, for a pretty raw deal, and doesn't really have any possessions of his own to speak of, besides his large family. And so this is when he begins to kind of sow the seeds of separation from Lavan's household. And we get all this kind of trickery with, there's a weird passage that we read last year about he makes a deal with Lavan that he'll get all the speckled and streaked goats and lambs from Lavan's herd, and then somehow Jacob places some sticks in the water, and all the baby goats and lambs come out streaked and speckled, and through this he amasses great wealth. It's a weird little sidetrack, and now we get, after kind of the 20th year, so he spent 14 years working for Lavan for the price of his 2 daughters, or the price of Jacob's 2 wives, and then an additional 6 years building up his wealth. And now at the end of 20 years, Jacob is finally ready to kind of take off from his father-in-law's house. So we're going to pick up together reading in the English for a little bit on page 180. I will put it up on the screen for the folks on Zoom. And I'm also I'll do the reading for now, just so that everyone, in whatever format you're in, can hear me. But I encourage you to stop me if you have any comments, and that means folks on Zoom, you can unmute yourselves, or folks here in the room, just raise your hand, and I'll pause as we read for the sake of stopping for questions and comments. But before we even get going, there's a question here.
So who is Dina, and where is her mother, and am I in the right family?
Yes, you are in the right family, and I did exactly what you were supposed to not do, which is kind of completely skip over the women in the story. That is something that, so sorry, and I should repeat the question. Joan Steinberg asked, who is Dina? Whose daughter is she? Why, is she even in the right story? And you are firmly in the right story, Joan, and yeah. So I did essentially exactly what the text does, which is the odds of Jacob having had 13 children, only one of whom is a girl, are incredibly low. There's all kinds of midrashim that in fact say that Jacob had, that each of the boy children was born with a girl twin sister, or that there's all kinds of other children who were born to, specifically female children who were born to him, who are not named. But we do get Leah's, it's actually Leah's final named birth child is Dinah, and that pops up in chapter 30, verse 21 on page 177. Ve'achar yalda bat vatikra et shma Dina. So last, Leah bore Jacob a daughter and named her Dinah. And yeah, this is kind of one of it's along the lines of kind of the great mysteries of Torah text, and also one of the things that can be so maddeningly abstract and frustrating about it, right? It gives us, for all the boy children, we get kind of, and he named, if you look anywhere else in the text, even the verse right before it, in bearing her 6th and final son, Leah said, God has given me a choice gift. This time my husband will exalt me, for I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulon. And so we get the rationale. We are to understand that there is kind of some deep thought and intention in naming all of the children. And then we finally do get, we do get one named female child, but we only get one verse about her. We don't even get the rationale for the name. And so, yeah, definitely not a great moment by me to leave her out of my retelling, but I think that is kind of the way, in some ways, it's the way the Torah leaves us to understand what to make of this, right? That we only get the partial story, and we are kind of reminded, whether we want to be or not, just how kind of patriarchal and paternalistic the Torah text is, right? I mean, you can't go back and edit it. And Dinah specifically is named to be, I believe she's specifically named by the text because she is an integral part of a story that will happen in the coming weeks, Parshiot, where she is raped and Jacob's other sons, or whether that's a whole nother narrative to dissect what exactly happens. But they name her specifically, I think, because she comes up as a central character in that narrative. And if it were to say, and now Jacob had a daughter who was, 14 and beautiful, we would say, well, when was she born? Where does this fit in the story? So it's almost like you got to give that one sentence. And I think we're all left wishing that there was more, but for now, that's all we know about her. Any other questions about the recap before we actually look at some text? Great. And folks on Zoom, like I said, I will find the right page and I will share the screen for the sake of us looking at the text together, but just make sure you figure out a way to wave me down if there's something you want to throw in. And we are at this point, we need one more, so I'm hoping we get there. Jean is coming at some point, so we'll do a little bit of Torah discussion. Then Jean will get here, and we'll all do a little dance in Jean's honor, and we'll get to the Torah service when Jean gets here. And you know what? We're still not going to do Musaf today, so we'll still get out at a reasonable time. But for now, let's look a little bit at the Torah text. So I put it up on the screen for the folks on Zoom, and let's pick up on chapter 31, verse 1 on page 180. And we're going to really dive in right into the tension between Jacob and between his father-in-law Laban's family. Now he, Jacob, heard the things that Laban's son were saying. Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from that which our father's he has built up all this wealth. Jacob also saw that Laban's manner toward him was not as it had been in the past. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Return to the land of your fathers where you were born, and I will be with you." Jacob had Rachel and Leah called to the field where his flock was, and said to them, "I see that your father's manner towards me is not as it has been in the past, but the God of my father has been with me. As you know, I have served your father with all my might, but your father has cheated me, changing my wages time and again. God, however, would not let him do me harm. If he being his father-in-law Laban said thus, 'The speckled shall be your wages,' then all the flocks would drop speckled young. And if he had said thus, 'The streaked shall be your wages,' then all the flocks would drop streaked young. God has taken away your father's livestock and given it to me." And on to page 181. Once at the mating time of the flocks, I had a dream in which I saw that the he-goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, and mottled. And in the dream, an angel of God said to me, "Jacob." "Here," I answered. And he said, "Note well that all the he-goats which are mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, and mottled, for I have noted all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now arise and leave this land and return to your native land." And we're just going to read through verse 17. Then Rachel and Leah answered him, saying, "Have we still a share in the inheritance of our father's house? Surely he regards us as outsiders now that he has sold us and has used up our purchase price. Truly, all the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, do just as God has told you. So I have some thoughts and ideas about that. I want to open it up. Yeah, Sharon, please.
I'm noticing twice it talks about how their father's manner has changed towards Yaakov. But it seems like he never was particularly kind to him, starting with, bargaining and tricking and all the rest of it. What's the implication, and what do you have to say about how his manner towards Jacob had changed from what it had been?
Yeah, so Sharon points out that 2 different times it says that it kind of points out that Jacob says that his father-in-law's behavior had changed towards him, but Sharon points out, and Sharon kind of taking the context of the whole rest of the portion, that the nature of their relationship was never all that kind of constructive or productive or friendly or loving. And so what has actually changed, and what do we make of Jacob pointing this out? I would say a couple things in response to that. The first is just that Lavan, in the imagination of the text, and certainly in the imagination of the rabbis, Lavan is kind of as bad as it gets. And so I think they take the opportunity over and over again to kind of remind us of that. And I think Jacob needing to say, this is enough, right? Like, I can tolerate someone's bad behavior to some level. I can tolerate, wanting to, or him wanting me to work for his daughters, which, was something that I assume was acceptable in the culture, especially since he did come empty-handed without a bride price or anything like that. I think it's important for Jacob is basically drawing a line in the sand and saying, enough is enough, and something has changed, right? 20 years seems like a lot to us, and maybe, to some way 20 years was reasonable, but at the end of 20 years, to still be no closer to like seemingly leaving, I think is the idea is kind of he's pushed over the edge a little bit. And I also think in that text we read, I think what Jacob's doing, and you'll see this, Jacob, and by extension Rachel and Leah, are giving every justification they can, right? I think there is a really deep discomfort with what they're doing, with this idea of sneaking away in the middle of the night, with this idea of leaving Lavan's house, this place where they have amassed great wealth, this place where they do have close family connections. And so you don't see it's not just that, Jacob feels like he's worked so much. It's not just that Jacob feels like all of a sudden his father-in-law has it out for him. It's not just that Jacob believes that, God has told him to go his own way. It's not just that Rachel and Leah also say, we've lost our inheritance and it's time for us to leave. It's all of these things. And so I think you see kind of needing to build up this like multi-pronged argument and justification, because it is such a difficult and kind of monumental decision. And my mom's pointing out in the chat, interesting that both daughters come together in agreement as this, and that certainly is kind of an interesting full circle kind of it's not. Doesn't fix that tension necessarily in any way, but it does kind of, it speaks to that same point of just kind of how important and monumental this is, that the whole family needed to be in agreement. And it's also possible that now that Rachel has her one son, she's also thinking differently, right? She's thinking about her own lineage too. And if her concern is, have we still a share in the inheritance of our father's house? Her concern is also her child, Joseph, and her hope to have more children, and wanting to make sure that they have what they seemingly deserve. I want to give it one or two more minutes if anyone has any other comments or thoughts, and then we actually, yeah, Leslie, please. Yeah, that's interesting, right? And so what Leslie's pointing out is that maybe it's actually not that Lavan has changed, that the father-in-law has changed, but that Jacob has changed, and that his own decision-making process has and his own patience have kind of evolved, and he's saying enough is enough. Yeah, which is a really interesting thought, right? And I think, listen, I've already said it once, I'll say it one more time, and I'll probably say it one more time before the end of the morning. They do not, they being like the author of the text, they being the rabbis, they do not like Lavan. And they do not want us to have any sympathy for Lavan. And so I think that I really like the point you're making. I think the text is very specific that like it's Lavan who has changed. It's Lavan that is acting badly, because that's really what the message they want us as the readers and us as the future Jews to be taking away from this. That and you'll see too, once the relationship falls apart, and then I see your hand, Bruce, I'll get to you in just 1 second. Once the relationship falls apart, all of a sudden you go back to calling Lavan the Aramean, right? And we'll see that in our reading that we do in chapter 31. Once this relationship falls apart, it's almost like these family bonds are completely shattered, and the text wants to remind us that in fact, this guy is not, we're still talking about Jacob's children's grandfather, right? If we all think of ourselves as children of Jacob, we're talking about like a pretty important part in the lineage of the Israelite Jewish people, but they really want us to keep in mind and distance ourselves from this guy. So yeah, it's a great thought. Bruce, go ahead.
So I apologize for joining late. Does anyone have your site this week?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll be there in 10 minutes.
Oh, we have a minion, Bruce, so I appreciate that. We're about to get going, but I do appreciate that. Thank you. So yeah, and Bruce just offered, he said that, if we were still looking for that 10th person, he would drive over. I'll also just address your comment and one other comment before we move on to the Torah service. We did count as a minion over Zoom for a really long time, which I am still generally comfortable with. I've said before, and I will, where we stand is that neither I nor the traditional kind of halakha Jewish law that we as a community kind of tended to ascribe to are comfortable counting as a minion that is split between people on Zoom and people in the room, especially just given the technological limits that we had. If we had a setup where everyone could hear and see everyone else, I think that would change things a little bit. But as it is now, myself and to some degree the people behind the technology desk are really the only conduits between the two different kind of communities. And as much as I am okay kind of finding creative loopholes that fit to enhance our practice, I'm not at the point yet of making that be enough, because I don't think it's totally fair to anyone, just because I think because of technological limitations, if there are 9 people on Zoom and 9 people in the room, it's not quite a group of 18 to anybody but me. And I think that is a little bit of a loss, to all 17 of those people. And I think we need to continue having conversations as a community of how we make sure that it's a fulfilling process to both of those groups of people, and however many people are kind of participating through whatever media they're participating in, but we're not quite there yet. So for the moment, if we are going to be doing in-person services and we're going to be taking out the Torah and saying things that only need a minyan to be said, we're going to need to have 10 people in the room. And if we want to discuss changing that, we can have some discussions, and we definitely need to do some kind of creative problem solving. And if we want to have people in the room, we need to make sure that, we have people who want to be showing up to services at a reasonable time. And we can also discuss what changes need to be made in that sphere to make sure that, we're not just spending our entire morning counting to 10 or looking at our watches. But we are at 10, and it is a really great Parsha, and Ron has Yortzeit, so we will get to Enel Maleh and eventually Mourner's Kaddish. And we're above 10 now, because Jean is here too. So we will pick back up in full minyan mode, and we will begin with the full Kaddish on page 138, and then I'll call Barry up to open the Ark and begin the Torah service. Page 138, you can sit or stand for the full Kaddish. Yitkadal v'ikadash me Rabbah, ve'alma divrach yirtei, ve'amlich malchutei, v'chayechon v'mechon v'chay v'chol Beit Yisrael, b'agalav izman kariv v'meru, Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach, le'olam me'ol maya, yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yitpar v'yitramam v'yinaseh, v'yitadar v'yitalei v'yitalal shmei d'kudesha, brichu, le'elam mikol berchata v'shirata, shukata v'nechamata, damiran be'alma v'yimeru, Amen. Titkabel tzonodom, l'chol Beit Yisrael, kadam lohon v'yishmaya v'yimeru, Amen. Yehei shalom rab min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'yimeru, Amen. Oseh shalom min romav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'yimeru, Amen. Page 139, you're up, Dr. Pastor.
Min komocho elim Adonai, min kemasecho, malchutecha, malchut kol olamim, umemshaltecha bechol dor vador, Adonai melech, Adonai malach, Adonai imot leolam va'ed. Adonai oz amo yitain, Adonai yavarech et amo b'shalom, av harachamim heitiv b'irtzoncha et Zion, tivnei chomot Yerushalayim, Ki vecha levad batachnu, melech elam ben Yisrael, Adon olamim.
And we rise.
Vayhi so Aharon, vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai v'yafutzu oivecha, ve'yanutzu misanecha mipanecha, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, udevar Adonai miYerushalayim, Baruch shenatan Torah, Torah, Baruch shenatan Torah, Torah, le'amo Yisrael, b'kedushato.
And we will continue on the top of page 140. In God do I put my trust, unto God's holy precious being do I utter praise. Open my heart to your Torah, answer my prayers and the prayers of all your people Israel, for goodness, for life, and for peace. Amen. Kadisha Yakira Ana Emar Tushbechan Ve'ana Rachetz Ve'ana Rachetz Ve'lishmei Kadisha Yakira Ana Emar Tushbechan Yehi Ravakadamach Detiftach Libi Bioraita Vetashlim Mishalin Delibi Veliba Dechol Amach Yisrael
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo.
Gadol Adonai Unaramema Shema Hayachol.
Adonai, Hagedula, V'Hagevura, V'Hatiferet, V'Hanetzach, V'Hahod, Ki Chol B'Shamayim U'Ba'aretz, V'Hafifai, Hagedul, V'Haminaseh, L'Chol Erosh, Romemu, Adonai Eloheinu, V'Hishtachavu, Lehadam Raglav Kadoshu, Romemu, Adonai Eloheinu, V'Hishtachavu,
Yikadosh Adonai Eloheinu.
You may be seated, and I think we did enough intro already this morning, so we are going to dive right into this morning's Torah reading, which does begin on page 181, which is chapter 31, verse 17. Oh, yeah. Oh, I gotta find the place, but yes, I'll get it. Got it. Yeah.
V'ya'azor v'yagen v'yoshia l'chol ha'chasim bo v'nomar. Amen. Hakol havu godel Eloheinu tnu kavod laTorah. Ya'amod Rishon. Nobody gave out the ayot yet. Ron, would you like to take Rishon? Come do Rishon. Ya'amod Raphael ben Yaakov v'Batya Golda Rishon Baruch Shenatan Torah Li'amo Yisrael B'Kedushato.
ואתם הדביקים באדוני אלוהיכם חיים כולכם היום.
And we're starting at the bottom of 181, verse 17.
Yep, that's right.
Right?
ויעקב.
ברכו את אדוני המברך.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד.
ברוך אדוני המברך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
אמן. ויקום יעקב ויישא את פניו ואת נשיו על הגמלים, וינהג את כל מקנהו ואת כל רכושו אשר רכש מקנה קניינו אשר רכש בפדן ארם, לבוא אל יצחק אביו ארצה כנען. ולבן הלך לגזוז את צאנו, ותגנוב רחל את הטרפים אשר להביאה. ויגנוב יעקב את לב לבן הרמי, על בלי הגיד לו, כי בורח הוא. ויברחו בכל אשר לו, ויברחו בכל אשר לו, ויקום, ויעבור את הנהר, ויעבור את הנהר, וישם את פניו הר הגלעד.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
And we will pause here to include an El Maleh in memory of Ron's mother, and her Hebrew name
Is my mother's name, Batya Golda, Yehoshua Ubela.
Golda Bat Yoshua Bella. El Maleh Rachamim Shochein Bamromim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechona Tachal Kanfei Ashchina, B'malot Kedoshim Uteorim Kezor Harakiam Asirim, Et Nishmat Batya Golda Bat Yoshua V'Bella Shalcha Lolama, בעבור שאנחנו מתפללים בעד הזכרת נשמתה בגן עדן תמנוחתה, לכן בעל רחמים יסתירה בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, ויצרור בתוככם את נשמתה, אדוני הוא נחלתה, ותנוח בשלום על משכבה, ונאמר אמן. Want to share anything, Ron?
My mother lived a long life, a good life. She was loving mother, loving wife. She was generous. She was stoic, and she was a lifelong learner. She kept on studying the visual arts. She was an artist, and she painted well into her 80s. And literally, the week that she had her stroke that ultimately took her life, she had taken out all of her art material, and she was going to begin to paint again. And unfortunately never happened. And throughout her efforts to recover after the stroke, she kept a good attitude, but ultimately it took its toll, and she passed away. And thankfully, I had the privilege of being by her side, holding her hand when she passed. And I'm blessed, my brothers were blessed to have a mother like ours.
Thanks for sharing, Ron.
You're welcome.
And it's good to see you. And just before we continue on, there's one verse I want to highlight very briefly, just because it is a driver of the narrative. And I kind of spoke in my intro this morning about how theft is really at the core of what drives this, especially this part of the triennial. And verse 19, at the end of verse 19, and Rachel stole her father's idols, and that is not something he knows. And so as we continue in this back and forth of trickery and deception, and again, kind of, do we see Lavan in the worst light possible, or what was going on in Lavan's imagination? Whether Jacob was stealing from him and whether that's justified is one question. He does come back to his house after being in the pasture and sees what is presumably one of his most precious kind of material items gone from his house, which are his kind of household idols, which had a tremendous amount of significance, I think we're to understand, in their culture. And so, as his own temper continues to ramp up, whether that was justified or not by Rachel is a whole nother question, and we can kind of read that into the emotional, the continued emotional intensity that exists in the rest of this portion. Joan and then Sharon.
And my question is, were they made out of some precious materials or something that signified wealth? Because it seems like, it wasn't just a religious thing about the idols, but later when, in the next paragraph, she's sitting on them, on the camel, hiding them. I mean, it seems like they must be some kind of object of wealth.
Yeah, so Joan asks if the idols had material wealth, and skipped ahead a little bit to see that Rachel hides them and sits on them on the camel. It's certainly not necessarily understood that they have material wealth. I think the kind of most simple reading is that they have spiritual significance and religious significance. And so there is, what's kind of most noteworthy about her sitting on them to hide them is just kind of an act of presumed kind of disrespect to Lavan's household gods. There's all kinds of different midrashic turns that this takes. Some of the rabbinic interpretation has to do with the fact that obviously Rachel was a righteous woman, and so her stealing the idols had to do with the fact that, she disapproved of her father's religion. A more simple and kind of straightforward reading could be that they were also significant to her, and so she wanted them because she knew she was never coming back to her father's house. But there's definitely kind of a couple different layers and narrative streams to explore there. But definitely it's a highlight worth, it's not a throwaway detail that she takes them. Did you want to?
Yeah, I just had another question that immediately following the verse 19 where it tells you that Rachel stole the idols, the translation for 20 is that Jacob kept Lavan in the dark, but the Hebrew is about stealing again. Vayigdov Lavan et lev Lavan, which literally is he stole Lavan's heart.
Yes. So I have about 500 words written on that, which I'm going to get to at the end of services, if everyone still has patience for a short Dvar Torah. So read that translation of verse 20 and keep it with you and think about what that means to steal someone's heart, because it also comes up again in verse 26. And I will share some. I don't want to give it all away right this second. We'll get back to that. So we are on we're on chapter 31, verse 22, which is on page 182. And we're going to be calling up Aliyot as you go. So if Sharon asks you to come up, just make your way up for an Aliyah.
Bob, you're on. Yeah. We're going to just go around the room.
Perfect.
Ya'amod sheni, ya'amod ben Zion, ben Shrega Konove, Godalea sheni. Well, I got one piece of it.
Oh, God.
Baruchu et Adonai Hamvarach.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam. Asher bachar banu mikol hamim. V'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Vayugad Lavan bayom hashlishi ki varach Yaakov. Vayikach et echav imo vayirdof acharav derech shivat yamim. Vayidabek oto behar hagilad. Vayavo Elohim elavan harami bachalom halayla. Vayomer lo hishamer lecha. Pin tidaber im Yaakov mitov ad ra.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam, asher natan lanu Torah emet, v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Marlene, is that you in the back?
Marlene, come on up for number 3.
And the third aliyah is chapter 31, verse 25, which is at the bottom of 182.
Ha'amod shlishit. Ha'amod. Malka.
Alexander Ziskin.
But
Alexander Ziskin.
Alexander Ziskin.
Esther.
The Esther shlishit.
Sharon, where's the... This.
Or do you want to tell me?
I don't wear a
Oh, then do that.
Right there.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Amen. Vayaseg Lavan et Yaakov, v'Yaakov tekat ohalo behar v'Lavan v'Lavan taka et echav behar hagilad. Vayomer Lavan liYaakov, me asita vatignov et levavi. Vatinhag et benoti keshruyot charev. Lama nichbeta livroach. Vatignov oti v'lo higadeta li. Vashlachacha besimcha uvesharim v'tofu v'chinor. V'lo nitshatani l'nashek livni livnai v'livnotai. Ata hiskalta eso yesh le'el yadi lasot imachem ra velo he'avichem emesh amar elai lemor hishamer lecha midaber im Yaakov mitov ad ra ve'ata haloch halachta ki nichsafta leveit avicha lama ganavta et Elohai vaya'an Yaakov vayomer leLavan ki yareti ki amarti pentigzol et benotecha me'imi im asher timtza et Elohecha lo yichyeh neged achinu haker lach Ma imadi v'kach lach v'lo yada Yaakov ki Rachel genavtam vayavo Lavan bohel Yaakov uvohel Leah uvohel shtei hamahot v'lo matza v'yatza me'ohel Leah vayavo bohel Rachel Verachel lachat hatrafim, v'tesamim bechar hagamal, v'tashov alehem, v'yimashesh Lavan et kol ha'ohel velo matza, v'tomer el haviha, al yichar b'nei Adoni, ki lo uchal lakum mipanecha, ki derech nashim li vayechapes velo matza et hatrafim.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tocheinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. And just a couple things to note as Janet makes her way up here for the next Aliyah. Jacob, the story of Jacob is filled with like these unintentionally fulfilled prophecies, right? And his words or the words of those around him coming back to bite him in the butt. And we see this very clearly in this conflict with Lavan, where he says, if anyone from my house took your idols, let that person die. And that's where we really see kind of the true level of deception that Rachel pulled off in taking these idols, that even Jacob didn't know about it. And of course, you know, that verse is kind of famously understood to be fulfilled in Rachel dying in childbirth with the birth of Benjamin. And I think the other thing that just strikes me as really noteworthy is I spoke before about how kind of Lavan is really separated from the family of Jacob, and it really is kind of, there is a like full and complete split that happens, but there is still this respect of Jacob's God and the God of Jacob's fathers, right? And so Lavan is visited by God and told not to do Jacob any harm, and even kind of at the peak of his anger, where it seems like he really does want to harm Jacob, kill Jacob, bring Jacob back by force, he says, well, your God, you know, the God of your fathers told me not to harm you, so I will not harm you. So there is this really kind of, still this really powerful image of God that is present throughout this story, even though it's not entirely clear whether everyone in the story, you know, especially as it's relating to the theft of idols. And so we see that this, you know, the monotheism has not kind of overtaken everyone's religious belief system, but there's still this understanding that the God that is mentioned is the all-powerful and God that is respected by more than just Jacob's household. We continue, we'll pick up on verse 36 for the fourth Aliyah, which is on page 184.
Ta'amod, Rivi'it, Ta'amod, Janet Bat William Verelin, Rivi'it.
Right there.
Baruch Adonai Hambarak.
Baruch Adonai Hambarak le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hambarak le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam. Asher bakar banu mikol ha'amim. V'natan lanu et Torah. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Amen.
Amen. Vayichar leYaakov vayarev belavan. Vaya'an Yaakov vayomer lelavan. Mapishi machatati ki dalakta acherai. Ki masasta et kol keli. Ma matzata mikol klei beitecha. Simko neged echai ve'achecha ve'ochichu ben shneinu ze 20 shana anochi imach rechelecha ve'izecha lo sakelu ve'leitzonecha lo achalti trefa lo haveiti elecha anochi echatena miadi tevakshena ginuvti yom uginuvti laila Haiti bayom achalan icharev vakerach ba'alayla vatidod shnati meinai zeli 20 shana beveitecha avadeticha 14 shana bishtei vnotecha v'sheish shanim betzonecha Utechalef et misacharati 10 monim lulei Elohei avi Elohei Abraham ufachad Yitzchak hayali ki ata rekam shelachtani et oniv et yagia kapi re'ei Elohim ve'yochach amesh.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher natan lanu Torah emet CAA olam nata botokenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Janet,
Jean.
come on down. The fifth aliyah is chapter 31, verse 43, which is on page 185. It's okay.
Ya'amod Chamishi, Ya'amod Eliyahu B'Tzalel ben Pinchas v'Chana, Chamishi.
Baruch Adonai Hambarach.
Baruch Adonai Hambarach Le'olam
Baruch
Va'ed.
Adonai Hambarach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Amen. Vaya'an Lavan, Vayomer El Yaakov, Habenot benotai, Vabanim banai, Ve'atzon tzoni, V'chol asher ata roeh lihu, Ve'livnotai, Ma'aseh le'ele hayom, O livnehem asher yalodu, Ve'ata lecha nichreta brit ani, Ve'ata v'hayeh le'ed beini u'beinecha, Vayikach Yaakov aven, Vayarimeha matzeva.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher natan lanu Torah emet. V'hei olam nata b'toheinu. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Leslie, you up for number 6? And the sixth aliyah is chapter 31, verse 46, which is on page 186. 185, sorry. But last word is on 185.
The very last words. Ta'amod shishit, ta'amod Leslie.
My name's Leah,
Leah.
and my parents, Bertha and Herschel.
Bertha?
And Herschel.
The Herschel, shishit.
Right there.
Watch this.
Oh, okay. Leslie. Go for it.
Baruch et Adonai Hambarach.
Baruch Adonai Hambarach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hambarach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Hasher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. V'naton lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Amen. Vayomer Yaakov le'achav liktu avanim, vayiklu avanim, vayasru gal vayochlu sham al hagal. Vayikra lo Lavan yegar shehaduta, ve'Yaakov kara lo galed. Vayomer Lavan hagal hazeh eid beini uvenecha hayom, al ken kara shmo galed. V'hamitzpeh asher amar yitzaf Adonai beini uvenecha, ki nistarish merehu im te'aneh et benoti, v'im tikach nashim al benotai. Ein ish imanu rei Elohim eid beini uvenecha.
Am I supposed to do this again?
Yep.
Yes.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher natan lanu Torat emet v'hayeh olam nata. What is it? Where? Oh, b'tachenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Yishar kochei.
Well done.
Thank you.
Awesome.
And if you couldn't quite get that over Zoom, Leslie was reading from the Hebrew, not the transliterated English. So I know that's been a lot of good practice going into that. Yasher koach.
Yes.
Oh, you can sit down.
Oh, never mind.
Joan or Bob, one of them.
And we are on verse 51, which is on page 186, and will take us through the rest of the portion.
Ta'amod, Shvi'it Ta'amod, Yehudit Bat Rishon.
Mashalav Moshe.
Moshe. Shvi'it.
Right there.
Baruch hu et Adonai Hamborach.
Baruch Adonai Hamborach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamborach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torto. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Amen. Vayomer Lavan leYaakov, Hine hagal hazeh, V'hine hamatzeva, asher yariti beini uvenecha, Eid hagal hazeh, V'eda hamatzeva, Im ani lo evor elecha et hagal hazeh, V'im ata lo tavor elai et hagal hazeh v'et hamatzeva hazot lera'ah, Elohei Avraham ve'Elohei Nechor yishpetu b'neinu, Elohei Avihem vayishava Yaakov befachad aviv Yitzchak, vayizvach Yaakov zevach bahar, vayikra lechav lechol lachem, vayochlu lechem vayalinu bahar, vayashkem Lavan baboker v'nashek levanav v'livnotav, vayevarech etheim, vayelech vayeshev Lavan limkomo, v'Yaakov halach ledarko, vayivku bo melachei Elohim, vayomer Yaakov kasher ra'am, machane Elohim ze vayikra shem makomahu machanayim.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tocheinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Please rise for the Chatzi Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba, ve'alma divrach yirtei v'amlich malchutei, b'chayechonu v'yomechonu v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, Bagala uvizman kariv bimeru amen. Yehei shmei Rabba mevorach leolam leomel maya yitbarach v'ishtabach v'itbar v'shema v'naseh v'itadar v'itale v'talal shemei dekudusha brichu leila mikol berchata v'shirata tushvechata v'nechermata damiran be'alma v'meru amen. And you may be seated. We will continue with the healing service. And folks on Zoom, I think you know the routine, but if you have a name you'd like included in the healing service, please put it in the chat and I will read it out loud when Sharon pauses.
And for beginning, please join me in the song written by our wonderful Deb. And let's sing it together. Mi sheberach avoteinu mikor habracha limotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing. And let us say, Amen. Mi sheberach imotenu Mekor habracha la'avotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. Misha berach avotenu v'imotenu, Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, Moshe, ve'Aharon, David, u'Shlomo, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, v'Leah, Bilha, v'Zilpa, v'Yivarech, v'Yerefeat, hacholim, b'nei Avraham, v'Sarah, b'nei Adam, v'Chava. May God, who blessed our ancestors, bless and heal all those in need of it now. Nancy Concanon, Shoshana Bat Pinchas V'Chana, Meir Ben Fega V'Aaron Yitzchak, Dennis McNeely, Jess Kramer, Alexis Watson, Bob Jelly, Bruce Mallory, Alan Mann, Joanne, Fred Gates, John O'Brien, Jacques Monse, Carol Barker, Ken Bosey, Sharon Morell, Chana Bat Rivka, Chaim Gedalia Ben Chana, Denise Stelmach, Rachel Barcelona, Kara Smoley, Adam Stander, Ann Perlman, Chana Esther Bat Ayala Hadar, Vasha Sarah Bat Chaya Rezel, Yehuda Yosef Ben Bunza, and anybody in the room who has a name you would like to include, if you would stand up now, we will include any? Ron. Okay, and right here.
Gayla, Angela,
And there are Zoom names.
Yes. Kathy Riley and Amy Merluzzi.
Do I need to say that or do
They should.
Okay, let's take just another couple seconds to acknowledge that we know there are names that haven't been mentioned and wish for healing for all who need it, whether we know them or not. בעבור שאנחנו מתפללים בעבורם, בישכר זה הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחמים עליהם, להחלימם ולרפאותם ולהחזיקם ולהחיותם, וישלח להם מהרה רפואה שלמה, רפואת הנפש ורפואת הגוף, שבתים לזעוק ורפואה קרובה לבוא, השתה בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ונאמר אמן.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Shikoah. In just 1 second, we'll continue with Maftir. I just want to share one more thought, actually not related to this morning's Parsha. And I know we've I've already said a lot about minyan versus not minyan, people in the room or people over Zoom, but I'm dwelling just a little bit and I want to really just acknowledge and appreciate everyone who comes to services, however you come to services. We do at this point have 11 people in the room and somewhere between like 12 and 15 people over Zoom. And if that were kind of our normal Shabbat morning service, we'd be busting out of the small sanctuary. And that's really wonderful. And I'm really appreciative of the folks who continue to sign in over Zoom. And I'm so glad that we still have that option. And I hope that you're able to find it a meaningful experience. And I hope that those of us who are in the room are able to make it a meaningful experience. And it does like speak to a lot of strength, actually, that 2 years later, we're still kind of, getting participation in both of those spheres. My own frustration with the kind of continual need to refigure things out and recreate, it comes out a little bit sometimes, which I apologize for. And I know that there are factors that certainly kind of are compromising the in-person experience, whether that's being in the large sanctuary or whether that's masks or whether that's starting at 9. And we can discuss all of these things, but I did just, and I know some people don't stick around all the way to the end of services, which is why I'm saying this now instead of in the announcements. I want to, make sure that you all feel the gratitude for showing up however you're able to show up. It's really important. And even if you can't all see each other, I do know that there is a connection between everyone who is tuning in whatever way they're tuning in. So I am really appreciative of that. And we will continue to tweak and evolve however we need to, even if I can't always keep quite as much patience as I should with that process. So thank you all for your patience with that. We will finish up with the Maftir, which is chapter 32, verse 1 on page 187. And again, we kind of just see like another casual encounter between, Jacob and a presence of the divine. And so we really do see kind of how ingrained, how just kind of every day it is for Jacob to be walking down the street and run into God and kind of have an encounter God. It's really kind of amazing, and it's a nice kind of, it brings this portion full circle, right? Because he started with that dream of encountering God and only having a rock to put his head down on, and now he's walking away from Lavan's house, a rich man, and encountering God again. Great.
Ya'amod maftir, Ya'amod Eitan Michael ben Shmuel Yehudit maftir.
Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Leolam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvorach Leolam Va'ed. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Ata Adonai noten ha'Torah.
Amen.
Vayashkem Lavan baboker, Vaynashek levanav v'livnotav, Vayevarech etem, Vayelech, Vayeshev Lavan limkomo, V'Yaakov halach ledarko, Vayifku bo malachei Elohim, Vayomer Yaakov kasher ra'am, Machane Elohim zeh, Vayikra Shem makom hahu Machanaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan Torah emet v'chai olam nata b'tocheinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Please rise for the lifting and dressing of the Torah. I'm happy to lift, yes.
It's interesting in the Maftir, you're talking about Lavan being not so much the outsider, but being looked down on. But when they leave, it says Lavan kissed his sons and daughters.
Yeah.
So there's still a relationship there.
Yeah, and actually, and sorry, I know you're all standing, so I'll keep this quick. We're going to talk about deficiencies in translations a little bit more. Chapter 32, verse 1, which Barry is pointing out, Vayashkem Lavan baboker, Vaynashek levanav v'livnotav, Vayevarech etem. Early in the morning, the translation here reads, Lavan kissed his sons and daughters and bade them goodbye. We all know the word bracha is he gave them a blessing. And so there certainly is, there is some connection that is still being maintained. And I do imagine this scene is very bittersweet, despite whatever tensions came beforehand, right? There certainly, despite whatever conflict there was, Lavan's not taking off in a huff. He's taking the time to kind of make a meaningful goodbye and a meaningful departure. And I think thinking about what the implications of that are and remembering that that's in fact how the story ends actually kind of paints a completely different picture than most of the narrative. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I share some words, but thank you for picking up on that, Barry. All right, now we're really going to lift the Torah. I'm going to do my best. V'zot ha'Torah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael v'Adonai v'yad Moshe. Torah, 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 tzivanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tzivanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tzivanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tzivanu Moshe. Avenu shalom aleichem, Avenu shalom aleichem, Avenu shalom aleichem, Avenu shalom, shalom, shalom.
Shalom Aleichem. You may be seated, and in just a minute, what? Yeah. Whatever you want to do, so seated. Yashikoff. You may be seated.
It takes a village.
In just a moment, we'll continue with the Haftarah. This morning's Haftarah begins with kind of a prophetic recap of what happened to Jacob. We're going to read the Ashkenazic version. I might cut it down slightly as I go because it's pretty long. So I think I'm just going to read the section. The Haftarah can be found on page 189. I'm going to read the section from chapters 12 and 13, and then maybe I'll skip to the last verse on page 193. But I think we'll save chapter 14 for another day. So page 189. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'ratza v'divreihem hanemarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'torah v'Moshe avdo u'v'Yisrael amo v'yeh ha'emet v'tzedek. Vayivrach Yaakov Sedei Aram, Vayavod Yisrael Bisha, Uvisha Shamar, Uvenavi Hela Adonai et Yisrael Mimitzrayim, Uvenavi Nishmar, Hachis Ephraim, Tamrurim, Vedamav Alav Yitosh, Vecher Pato, Yashiv Lo Adonav, Kedaber Ephraim retate Nasahu beYisrael Vayesham Baal Vayamot Ve'ata Yosifu Lachato Ve'asu Lahem Masecha Mikaspam Kitvunam Atzavim Masech Harashim Kula Lahem Heim Omrim Zovchei Adam Agalim Yeshakun Lachen Yukanan Boker Vechatal Mashkim Holech Kemot Yisoer Migoren Ucheashan Me'aruba Vanochi Adonai Elohecha Me'eretz Mitzrayim Ve'Elohim Zulati Lo Teda U'Moshia Ayin Bilti Ani Yedaticha Bamidbar Be'eretz Tal Uvot Kamir Itam Vayispa'u Savu Vayaram Libam Al Ken Shechechuni Vehi Lahem Kemo Shachal Kenemer Al Derech Ashur Efka Shem Kedov Shakul Va'ekra Segor Libam Vochle Sham Kelavi Chayat Asadeh Tivakem Shechetcha Yisrael Kivi Ve'ezrecha Ehei Malkecha Efo Ve'oshiacha V'chol Arecha Ve'shoftecha Asher Amarta Tenali Melech V'sarim Eiten Lecha Melech Be'api Va'ekach Be'evrati Tzarur Avon Ephraim Tsefuna Chatato Chevle Yolada Yavo Lo Huvein Lo Chacham Ki Et Lo Yamod Bamishpar Banim Miad Sheol Eftem Mimavet Egalem Ehi Dvarecha Mavet Ehi Katavcha Sheol Nocham Yisater Me'enai Ki Hu Benachim Yafri Yavo Kadim Ruach Adonai B'midbar Ola Vevosh Mekoro Vecharav Meonyo Hu Yishse Otzar Kol Kli Chemda. And I'm going to turn the page and skip to the last verse on page 193. Michacham v'yavein ele navon v'yedaim ki yesharim darchei Adonai v'tzadikim yalchu bam ufoshim yekashlu bam.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, tzur kol amim, tzadik b'chol adorot, el haneman, haomer ve'oseh, hamdaber umkayim, shekol dvarav emet v'tzedek, neman atahu Adonai Eloheinu, v'nemanim dvarecha, v'davar echad midvarecha, chur le'ashuv reikam, ki al melech neman rachaman atah, baruch atah Adonai, ha'el haneman b'chol dvarav. Rachem al Tzion ki veit chayenu, v'aluvat nefesh toshia bimhera b'yameinu, baruch atah Adonai, misameach Tzion bevaneha. Samcheinu Adonai Eloheinu b'elyon avi avdecha, v'malchut beit David meshichecha, bimhera yavo v'yagel libeinu, al kisolo yeshev zar, v'lo yinchalu od acharim et kvodo, ki v'shem chodshecha nishbata lo, shelo yichben ero leolam va'ed, baruch atah Adonai, magen David. Al haTorah ve'al havodah ve'al hanevim ve'al yom haShabbat hazeh shenatata lanu Adonai Eloheinu likdusha v'limnucha lechavod ultifaret al hakol Adonai Eloheinu anachnu modim lach u'mevarchim otach yitbarach shimcha befi kol chai tamid leolam va'ed baruch atah Adonai mekadesh haShabbat. We will now turn to page 153 and rise as Barry Pastor comes back up to put away the Torah.
Yahalelu Eshem Adonai Kinishke Shemu Levado.
Odo al eretz v'shamayim vayarem keren li'amo tila lechol chasidav livnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Havul Adonai b'nei Elim, Havul Adonai kavod va'os, Havul Adonai kavod shemo, Hishtachavul Adonai behadrat kodesh. Kol Adonai v'hakoach, Kol Adonai behadar, Kol Adonai shomer arazim, v'yishaber Adonai et arzei halvanon.
Vayakidem kamo egel, v'banon v'sirion, kamo men re'emim.
Kol Adonai chotzev lavotesh, Kol Adonai yachil midbar, Kol Adonai v'arazim v'yishaber Adonai et arzei halvanon. Sorry, I might have lost the place there. That's on me. Kol Adonai. Bye bye. Kol Adonai. So I went back again. I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. Uvayecha Sophia Uvehechalo kulo omer kavod, Adonai lamavu yashav, vayeshev Adonai melech leolam, Adonai osliam oiten, Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. Va'im hi lama chazikim ba v'topeha meushar v'racheha lachem olam v'tov tzivroteha shalom Shivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva Kadesh Kadesh Yameinu Kadesh Yameinu kekedem Kadesh Yameinu Kadesh Yameinu Kadesh Yameinu kekedem Amen. Yasher Koach Barry, my apologies for assuming that I knew the words. I should always make sure I'm reading closely. You all may be seated. No, it was not, that time it was certainly not just you. That was on me. And if we didn't have a sound system, I might have been able to get away with it. But the microphone means that everyone can hear me when I get things wrong. So sorry about that. I want to spend just a couple more minutes thinking about kind of the theme of theft in this morning's Parsha. And I've already hinted at this a couple times, but it is something that I think is worth exploring in just a little bit more depth. And I want to start by revisiting a few of the lines from the poem with which I started services this morning. And that, of course, was called The Theft by Gregory Jananikian, which, again, probably butchering that one too. In writing about a man who has had something stolen from him, he writes, "If he wished anything, it was to be a thief, running wild and blessed into the streets of the city, to whom nothing was sacred, or else everything was." As we reflect on those words, I want to reiterate that I chose that poem this morning because of the dominance of the theme of theft throughout this morning's Torah reading. By my count, the Hebrew roots of ganav or gazal, to steal or to rob, can be found 9 different times in chapter 31. The usage I find most striking, however, as Sharon pointed out earlier, comes in chapter 31, verses 20 and 26. In the original Hebrew, these verses read, "Vayignov Yaakov et lev Lavan harami, al bli higid lo ki voreachu," and "Vayomer Lavan liYaakov me asita vatignov et levavi vatinheg et benotai kishvuyot charev." The core phrase in each of those verses describes Vayignov et levav, that Jacob, it's translated in our Chumash as Jacob kept Lavan in the dark, or Jacob tricked Lavan. But for those of you with a Hebrew background, will likely find yourselves just as disappointed in that translation as I was. The translation of tricking Lavan or keeping him in the dark is incredibly euphemistic. What these words actually mean, literally translated from the Hebrew, is that Jacob stole Lavan's heart. In a portion that is all about theft, the theft of idols, the theft of wages, accusations of thievery flying back and forth from one party to another, the translators decided to take what I find to be the most poetically and kind of achingly beautiful verse about theft, and they really kind of sterilize it. As opposed to accepting my disappointment in the translation of the Jewish Publication Society's words in our Chumash, I decided to take on a search for one that I liked better, either in the commentaries or in a different translation. After all, what's the point of the magic of the internet if not finding exactly the answer you already know you want? And I spent some time looking. It's actually really easy to do. You can type in a verse and you can get pretty quickly, I think I looked at 24 different translations of this verse from a whole bunch of different Hebrew editions, from kind of all of the, not all, but a long list of English translations of different Christian Bibles. And with one exception in a Jewish publication and one exception in a Christian Bible, they all had some version of this verse. They all had this verse translated as some version of Jacob tricking or deceiving his father-in-law Laban. So I went to Robert Alter, who is kind of the go-to modern scholar or the go-to Jewish modern scholar on English translations of the Bible. And in his translation of the book of Genesis, he likewise translates this phrase as Jacob deceived Laban. But he also includes the following note: literally steals the heart of Laban. The heart being the organ of attentiveness or understanding. In other words, to the ancient writer, the heart wasn't, as we may think of it, the seat of emotions and feelings. It was more akin to how we think of the brain. And so this word of stealing the heart actually does kind of implies or means deception or trickery. I still don't quite want to leave it at that. I recognize that no matter what, this verse is using a literary device. In verse 19, it does explicitly state that Rachel stole Laban's idols. And in verse 20, Jacob is tricking Laban, and it reads better because of that continuity if we write that Jacob stole something too. You don't get to be the best-selling book of all time without employing some fancy literary tricks. This morning, however, I want us to read our own understanding of the heart into this chapter, and the important shift of perspective engendered in reading this phrase not solely as Jacob deceived Laban, but literally as Jacob stole Laban's heart. Laban, as I've mentioned already, is one of the Torah's bad guys. In fact, according to rabbinic tradition, as recounted in our Passover Haggadah, Laban is worse than Pharaoh. The logic there is that Pharaoh wiped out only the male Israelite babies, but Laban, through his oppression of Jacob and his deceiving of Jacob, really wanted to wipe out all of Jacob's line, male and female. The writers of our text and the rabbinic commentators, they really have a vested interest in maintaining Laban's evil image. But what I want us to do is to put the midrashic interpretations aside and just for one moment to consider this story through Laban's eyes. Imagine going out to your faraway pasture, being a 3 days journey from your home, grazing your flock, and hearing whispers that your son-in-law has taken your 2 daughters, your 12 grandchildren, and even your household gods, and snuck away in the middle of the night. Even if your heart was as cold and blackened as the rabbis imagine Laban's to be, it would still be broken. Jacob suffered for 20 years at the hands of his father-in-law. Time and time again, he is portrayed as the victim of Laban's trickery and deception. Yet, when Jacob decides he's had enough, in some ways he lowers himself to Laban's level. He doesn't strive to repair or reinforce an important family relationship. Instead, he decides to steal Laban's heart. As a result, there's a very tense standoff, which thankfully is resolved without violence or bloodshed. But it's important to note that after this chapter, Jacob and his family never see Laban again. Maybe that's the best for both of them, and there are certainly times when hurtful or destructive relationships need to be terminated, but it's worth keeping in mind that this relationship ending also means that Rachel and Leah never again see their father, and their children never get to reconnect with their grandfather. None of these characters will ever revisit the place and the community in which they were born and raised. There's a tremendous potential loss for everyone through this estrangement and alienation. My hope is that in our own relationships and interactions, we remember how damaging it can be to resort to measure for measure actions, and that our goal shouldn't be to get revenge or to get even or to steal people's hearts, but rather to strengthen, to rebuild, and to reconnect with the people in our lives whenever possible. We'll continue together on page 181 with the Kaddish Shalem. You can stand or sit. Yitgadal v'ikadash shmei Rabbah, be'alma divrach yirtei, ve'amlich malchutei, b'chaychon u'v'yechon u'chay l'chol Beit Yisrael, b'agala v'zman kariv v'meru, amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach, le'olam me'ol maya, yitbarach, yitbarach v'shabach, yitbar v'tshuma v'naseh, v'tadar v'talei v'talal shmei l'kudusha, brichu, le'elam mikol berchata v'shirata, shchata v'nechama, Amiran Be'alma V'meru, Amen. Titkabal Tzonoton, the whole Beit Yisrael, Kadam V'chon V'shmaya V'meru, Amen. Yehei Shlam Rab Min Shemaya, V'chaim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'meru, Amen. Oseh Shalom Imromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom, Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael, V'al Kol Yisrael Tevel V'meru, Amen. Page 182, Ein Keloheinu. Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Micheloheinu, Michadonenu, Michemalkeinu, Michemoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adonenu, Nodel Malkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adonenu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu, Atahu Shektiru Avotenu, Lefanecha Ketoret Hasamim. Page 183, we rise for Aleinu. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol, latei kedula leotzer breshit, shelo asanu kegoyei haratzot, velo samanu kemishpechot adama, shelo sam chelkeinu kahem, Vegor aleinu kechol hamonam, v'anachnu korim, umishtachavim umodim, lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, hakadosh baruch hu, shehu noteh shamayim v'yoseh la'aretz, umoshav yikaro b'shamayim imal, ushchinatu zo, Ushchinatu zo, begavhei meromim, hu Eloheinu ein od, emet malkeinu efes ulato, kakatuv b'torato, v'yadatayom v'hashevota elevavecha, ki Adonai hu Elohim, Bashamayim mimal v'al haaretz mitachat einod. And at the bottom of the page, Kakatuv b'toratecha, Adonai imloch leolam va'ed, v'nemar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz, vayom hahu yeh Adonai echad, Ushemo, Ushemo, Ushemo Echad. And in just a moment, we'll continue with Mourner's Kaddish on page 184. In addition to the Yortzites in our community, Bruce has asked me to bring in the memory and honor the memory of Aaron Feuerstein, who recently passed away, the owner of Malden Mills. And in Bruce's note, he writes, "You will remember he famously paid his workers for 3 months after the mill burned down. Asked why he did such a noble thing, he said it was the right thing to do. And later in his life, when he was asked about it, he essentially said it wasn't such a big deal." And the other, actually, which just one more tie into this morning's Parsha, and then we'll continue with Kaddish Yatom. If we're looking for another contemporary connection, it is kind of Jacob standing up for himself and his rights as an underpaid worker, right? And if we're looking for kind of a contemporary, if we're looking for a message that we can take to, or another message that we can take to larger society that we're drawing from this ancient text, is kind of how it looks like from Jacob's perspective to be kind of abused and underappreciated and underpaid for 20 years. And of course, we can understand that Jacob would get to a breaking point, and recognizing that things like that are still happening, around us all the time. And it's easy for us to forget that or to choose not to see that, but it is an important reminder. And of course, on the more kind of immediate communal level, this week we honor the Yortzeit of Beatrice Pressler, and we will come together for Mourner's Kaddish on page 184. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, Be'alma divrach yirutei, ve'amlich malchutei, be'chayechon, u'byomechon, u'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kariv, v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabba mevorach le'olam u'mei olmaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei d'kudesha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, v'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. You may be seated. Once again, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here, however you are here. Thank you to Bonnie and new trainee Joan Steinberg for making sure everyone could hear us and see us. And thank you to Janet for keeping an eye on the front door. A couple quick announcements. An event going on tomorrow afternoon, which isn't a synagogue event, but may be of interest to some folks who are local. St. Paul's Church, the one where we did our outside Friday night services, they are hosting an organization called Swords to Plowshares, and they are actually bringing a forge into their courtyard and melting down guns that were voluntarily were received in a voluntary buyback program, and they are actually making them into gardening tools, which they then use to raise additional funds. So that's from 1 to 4 in the St. Paul's courtyard. Should be a beautiful day tomorrow, so certainly check that out. And then next Sunday, we are getting fully into Hanukkah and Thanksgiving mode. My mom and Fran Kaplan will be co-teaching a class, baked sweet potato latkes on Zoom. That information is in the e-blast. Sign up for the link. And there's going to be a lot of great stuff happening around Hanukkah time. I guess I'll mention the one Sunday after that. Our mezuzah is in disrepair. We have a new mezuzah lined up to be installed. So on the first night of Hanukkah, we're going to gather here at 4:30, install a mezuzah together, have some hot chocolate and jelly donuts, and then walk down to Market Square to light the menorah in Market Square. And there's going to be a lot more stuff going on around Hanukkah, so please just keep your eye on the e-blast. Any other announcements or things that people wanted to share? Great, so we can rise for Hatikva and then Kiddush, and then we do have coffee brewing downstairs if it's a beautiful day outside, if folks want to have a cup of coffee or decaf on the front steps outside. First Hatikva. Kol od v'alevav penima nefesh Yehudi homi'ah Ufate Mizrach Kadima Ayin Letzion Sophia Olo Avda Tikvateinu Hatikva Bat Shnot Alpayim Liot Am Chofshi Ve'artzeinu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim Liot Am Chofshi Ve'artzeinu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim Ve'shamru B'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat V'asot et HaShabbat Ledorotam Berit Olam Ve'shamru B'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat V'asot et HaShabbat Ledorotam Berit Olam B'nei uvein B'nei Yisrael Oti le'olam Oti le'olam Ve'shamru B'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat V'asot et HaShabbat Ledorotam Berit Olam Ki sheshamim asa Adonai et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz Ve'shamru B'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat V'asot et HaShabbat Ledorotam Berit Olam Uve'yom hashvi Shabbat vayinafa Shabbat vayinafash Ve'shamru B'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat V'asot et HaShabbat Ledorotam Berit Olam Al Kain, Barach Yom Hashua v'Yigadsheu Savri Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Borei Peri Hagafen. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. If you're here, stick around, have a cup of coffee. If you're at home, unmute yourself and say hi to the people on Zoom. Great to see you all. Have a good week. Enjoy the beautiful 3 hours of daylight we have left.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Have a nice day. Bye.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Deborah. Speak to you soon. Great to see you. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Steve. Okay.
Wow, that was fast. That was fast.